November 1st, 1943, Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. The volcanic sand felt coarse beneath Sergeant Milan Gravich's boots as he crouched behind a makeshift defensive position, scanning the jungle tree line for any sign of Japanese movement. In his hands rested something that should never have existed outside an aircraft, something regulations never intended for infantry use. The weapon looked as if it had been assembled in a workshop by someone focused more on results than procedure. A salvaged aircraft machine gun ripped from a downed dive bomber, now fitted with a crude bipod, still carrying the scent of welding and improvisation. When the Japanese attacked 2 days later, on November 3, 1943, Gravich's improvised weapon unleashed fire at a rate that seemed impossible for a ground-based gun, spitting rounds at velocities no standard marine machine gun could match. What Gravich did not realize was that this unauthorized modification, born of necessity and frustration, would evolve into one of the most formidable infantry weapons of the Pacific War. It would help shift the tide on the bloodiest beach in Marine Corps history, where more American blood soaked into volcanic sand than any other Pacific battlefield. The path to that moment began with a problem that plagued every Marine rifle company in the Pacific, a problem written in the blood of men who died waiting for adequate fire support. The standard M19E19A6 Browning machine gun, while reliable, was a heavy beast. 32 pounds of steel requiring multiple men to move efficiently. Its rate of fire, roughly 400 to 550 rounds per minute, offered suppressive fire but lacked the crushing volume needed to quickly neutralize Japanese pillboxes and fortified positions. Marines often watched comrades fall while waiting for machine guns to be repositioned, reloaded, or brought forward. The weapon was adequate in defensive positions or mounted on vehicles, but insufficient for the rapid infantry assaults that defined Pacific Island combat. In the dense jungles and across volcanic beaches, mobility meant survival, and firepower meant victory. The M1919A6 offered neither in sufficient measure. Pacific combat demanded weapons that could meet specific challenges. Japanese defenses were expertly constructed, using terrain and volcanic rock to create mutually supporting fields of fire. A single camouflaged pillbox could pin down an entire platoon. Standard responses required coordination. Machine guns laid down suppressive fire, while demolition teams moved close enough to destroy positions with satchel charges or flamethrowers. But coordination took time, and time cost lives. The M1919A6's moderate rate of fire allowed defenders to move between bursts, keeping their positions active even under suppression. Advancing Marines needed weapons that could deliver so much fire that enemy soldiers couldn't lift their heads to return fire. The M1919D, My-19D, Seamaders could not do that. Weight compounded the problem. At 32 1 to 2 pounds, plus ammo, spare barrels, and the tripod, a machine gun section required at least 3 men to operate effectively. In fluid island combat, where Marines might advance only a few hundred yards before being pinned down, moving a heavy machine gun under fire was extremely difficult and hazardous. Individual Marines felt this problem keenly every time they watched the gun section struggle to keep pace with the advancing rifle platoon. Survival often depended on fire support that arrived seconds too late, with insufficient volume to suppress entrenched defenders effectively. Milan Gravich understood this problem better than most. Born in Minnesota on May 24, 1924, he had joined the Marine Corps with a machinist's grasp of how things worked and how they could be improved. His pre-war civilian experience had given him hands-on skill with metal fabrication, knowledge of tolerances and stress points, and practical know-how to modify existing equipment to serve new purposes. When Gravich volunteered for the newly formed Marine Parachute Battalions, he brought not only courage, but mechanical ingenuity. The Paramarines were an experiment, an elite unit meant to drop behind enemy lines and create chaos. They trained harder, fought fiercer, and thought differently than conventional Marines. The parachute battalions drew men who sought the toughest challenges, the most demanding training, and believed that elite units required elite soldiers. The training regime was deliberately brutal, designed to weed out anyone who lacked the physical stamina or mental toughness for airborne operations. Those who survived the selection process formed tight-knit units characterized by initiative, adaptability, and a willingness to question conventional approaches. This culture of innovation would prove crucial when Gravich encountered his first ANM-2 aircraft machine gun during the Bougainville campaign. The Paramarines were encouraged to innovate to find solutions where regulations saw only obstacles. Officers in the parachute battalions understood that elite troops operating behind enemy lines would face situations that no manual could address, that survival and mission success would depend on the ability to improvise and adapt. This institutional culture created the environment in which the Stinger could be conceived. In a conventional Marine unit, a sergeant modifying government property without authorization might face court-martial. In the Paramarines, that same sergeant's initiative might be rewarded with approval and support. The AM-2 represented everything the M1919A6 was not. Where the ground gun weighed 32 deadliest, the aircraft version weighed just 21 warub. This remarkable weight reduction was achieved through fundamental redesign rather than simple material substitution. The engineers at Fabry National had created the weapon specifically for aircraft use where every ounce mattered, for payload capacity and fuel efficiency. The barrel walls were significantly thinner than those of ground-based machine guns. The receiver was manufactured from lighter materials with reduced safety margins. In a ground weapon, these modifications would be catastrophic, leading to rapid barrel failure and potentially dangerous malfunctions. But aircraft machine guns operated in a completely different environment. Their real revelation was its rate of fire. Where the standard ground machine gun fired 400 to 550 rounds per minute, the AM-2 could achieve 200 to 500 rounds per minute. This incredible cyclic rate was possible because aircraft machine guns were cooled by the high-velocity slipstream of flight. At cruising speeds, air rushing past the weapon carried away heat faster than it could accumulate, allowing the thin barrel to sustain rates of fire that would melt a ground-based weapon within seconds. The weapon had been designed for rear-facing defensive positions on dive bombers and patrol aircraft, where gunners needed maximum firepower in brief engagements against attacking fighters. In aerial combat, engagements lasted seconds. A gunner might have only a 3 or 4 second window to hit an attacking aircraft before it broke off or completed its attack. In those brief moments, volume of fire mattered more than sustained fire capability. The AM-2's original configuration reflected its intended use. Spade grips designed for standing gunners using both hands. Solenoid triggers activated by electrical switches for synchronized fire through propeller arcs. Mounts designed to traverse quickly in confined aircraft turrets. None of these features translated well to ground combat, but the fundamental performance characteristics offered revolutionary potential for infantry use. By late 1943, aircraft machine guns were becoming surplus equipment in the Pacific theater. As American air superiority grew increasingly dominant, as fighter aircraft mounted heavier 50-caliber weapons and 20mm cannons, the 30-caliber defensive weapons became obsolete. The strategic bombing campaign required heavy defensive armament, but fighter superiority meant that bomber formations faced fewer attacks, reducing the need for defensive guns. Damaged aircraft were cannibalized for parts throughout the Pacific Islands. Crashed planes littered beaches and jungles across the theater. Aircraft that sustained damage beyond economical repair were stripped of useful components before being abandoned or destroyed. Among these components were AM-2 machine guns designed for aircraft, but now available to anyone with the ingenuity to envision alternative uses. Enterprising Marines like Private William Colby from Gloversville, New York, began to see opportunity where regulations saw only scrap metal. During the early days of the Bougainville campaign, Colby salvaged an AM-2 from a crashed aircraft. His modification was crude but functional. He left the awkward spade grips intact, but added a bipod to the muzzle end, creating a hybrid weapon that combined aircraft firepower with minimal ground stability. When Japanese forces attacked his position on November 3, 1943, Colby deployed his modified weapon with devastating effect. Fed ammunition by his assistant gunner, Private Edward Crumlish, he repelled the assault with firepower that shocked both sides. The weapon overheated quickly, without the cooling effect of aircraft slipstream. It lacked any proper stock for aiming, making accurate fire difficult. The spade grips were awkward for a prone gunner. But despite these limitations, it worked. The psychological impact on Japanese attackers was immediate and profound. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers had grown accustomed to the rhythmic fire of American machine guns. The Browning's distinctive sound and cadence were familiar, almost predictable. Attackers learned to time their movements, to advance during pauses, to seek cover when fire intensified. Cole's modified aircraft gun shattered this learned behavior. The rate of fire was so high that it produced not the familiar rhythmic bursts, but a continuous roaring tear, like fabric being ripped apart at enormous scale. Japanese attackers who attempted their usual tactics found themselves caught in fire that seemed to fill the air itself, that left no gaps for movement, that created an almost solid wall of lead. Grevich watched KBY's improvised weapon in action and saw not just a field modification, but the beginning of something revolutionary. The crude nature of Cole's conversion actually highlighted the weapon's potential. If this barely modified aircraft gun could produce such devastating results, what might be possible with a proper conversion designed specifically for infantry use? Together with Private First Class John Little, Grevich began work on what would become the first true Stinger machine gun. They started with an AM-2 that had been brought ashore at Empress Augusta Bay, likely salvaged from a damaged aircraft, or obtained through the informal supply networks that existed between Marine ground units and Navy aviation personnel. The spade grips, designed for aircraft gunners using both hands in a standing position, were clearly useless for infantry work. A prone infantryman needed a trigger he could operate with one hand while maintaining his grip on the weapon and sight picture. Grevich fabricated a trigger mechanism from sheet metal, crude in appearance but functional in operation. The design was simple by necessity, a mechanical linkage that transferred finger pressure to the weapon's firing mechanism. For a stock, they cut down an M1 Garand rifle butt stock. The Garand stock was solid walnut, designed to withstand the considerable recoil of the 306 cartridge, but it was also precisely shaped to fit the human shoulder and cheek, offering the kind of stable shooting platform that the aircraft gun lacked. Grevich carefully hollowed out the stock to accept the unique shape of the aircraft machine gun's buffer tube, a painstaking process that required precision cutting to maintain the stock's structural integrity while achieving proper fit. From a Browning automatic rifle, they took the bipod and rear sight. These components offered multiple advantages beyond their functional capabilities. Every Marine was already trained on the bar, already familiar with its sight picture and bipod deployment. Using these components meant the Stinger would feel familiar despite its revolutionary performance, reducing training time and making the weapon more intuitive for Marines transitioning from standard weapons. The bipod provided front-end stability crucial for controlling the weapon's high rate of fire. The bar sight offered aiming capability superior to the original aircraft sights, which had been designed for aerial gunnery, where point shooting and tracer observation mattered more than precision aiming. The result was a weapon unlike anything in the Marine Corps arsenal. 40 in long, 25 LEB, fully configured, belt-fed with a 100-round ammunition box. It looked cobbled together because it was an amalgamation of three different weapon systems held together by ingenuity and necessity. The aesthetic was purely functional, lacking the refined lines of factory-produced weapons. Welds were visible. The stock showed obvious modification. The trigger mechanism looked improvised because but function mattered more than form. And when Gravich test-fired the weapon, the results exceeded even his optimistic expectations. The cyclic rate remained close to the original aircraft specification, somewhere between 200 and 500 rounds per minute. In practical terms, this meant the Stinger could deliver 3 times the volume of fire as the M1919. A 3-second burst would send approximately 70 to 75 rounds downrange. The standard 100-round ammunition box would empty in approximately 5 seconds of continuous fire. These numbers translated into overwhelming tactical advantages. Japanese pillboxes that could withstand suppression from conventional machine guns found themselves unable to maintain defensive fire when engaged by the Stinger. The sheer volume of rounds pouring through firing ports forced defenders to take cover, creating the precious seconds needed for demolition teams to advance. The Stinger that Gravich and Little assembled on Bougainville saw no combat during that campaign. The fighting concluded before they could properly test their creation in battle. But the weapon represented proof of concept, validation that aircraft machine guns could be successfully converted for infantry use, with dramatic improvements in firepower. The Marine parachute battalions, despite their elite status and intensive training, were disbanded on February 29, 1944. The Paramarines had never conducted an actual combat jump. By late 1943, American strategists had concluded that large-scale airborne operations were impractical in the Pacific theater. The strategic geography of the Pacific imposed constraints that made airborne operations far less viable than in Europe. Pacific targets were small islands rather than continental landmasses. The typical island objective might be only a few miles across, offering limited drop zones and minimal space for airborne forces to operate independently. Most islands were so small that any airborne insertion would land forces within range of beach defenses, negating the primary advantage of vertical envelopment. Furthermore, the distances involved in Pacific operations created logistical challenges for airborne forces. European airborne operations could launch from relatively nearby bases, with transport aircraft returning to friendly airfields after dropping troops. Pacific operations required carriers or captured airfields thousands of miles from major bases. The specialized aircraft needed for parachute operations competed with bombers and transports for limited resources. The Navy, which controlled strategic movement in the Pacific, showed little enthusiasm for airborne operations that required dedicating aircraft and ships to specialized parachute units. Amphibious assault, the Navy's preferred method, allowed the concentration of overwhelming force at the point of attack with continuous naval gunfire support. Airborne forces, by contrast, would be isolated and vulnerable until ground forces could link up with them. The Paramarines were scattered across the Fleet Marine Force, their expertise distributed among conventional units. This disbandment, while disappointing to the elite troops who had trained so hard for airborne operations, actually served to spread the Paramarine culture of innovation and aggressive problem-solving throughout the Marine Corps. Milan Gravich found himself reassigned to the machine gun section of G Company, 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division. This reassignment would prove fortuitous, placing him in a position to revive and refine the Stinger concept for the most important battle of his life. The 5th Marine Division was activated on January 21, 1944, at Camp Pendleton, California. It was built around cadres from the disbanded parachute battalions, inheriting not just their personnel, but their culture of aggressive innovation and willingness to challenge conventional approaches. The division included the 26th, 27th, and 28th Marin Regiments, with the 28th receiving a disproportionate number of former Marines. From its inception, The division was slated for a major amphibious assault. Though the specific target remained classified throughout much of their training throughout 1944, as the division trained at Camp Pendleton and later in Hawaii, rumors circulated about their eventual destination. Some speculated they would assault Formosa. Others believed they were bound for the Philippines or the China coast. The truth, when it finally came during classified briefings in late 1944, would prove more daunting than any rumor. The 5th Marine Division was bound for Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck in the Pacific that intelligence estimated would require 1 week to secure. The actual battle would last 36 days and demand more Marine blood than any battle in the Corps' history. When Grevich joined G Company in November 1944, their regiment was deep in training for Operation Detachment, the code name for the Iwo Jima invasion. The training regime was intense, focusing on the specific challenges of assaulting heavily fortified positions across difficult terrain. Mock beaches were constructed to simulate volcanic sand. Live fire exercises tested coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. During these exercises, Grevich quickly grew frustrated with the performance of his company's light machine gun sections. The problem he had observed on Bougainville had not been solved. The Marine Corps had not fielded any new weapons that addressed the fundamental limitations of the M1919A6. Marines were still training with the same weapons, facing the same tactical constraints, accepting the same casualties that better equipment might prevent. During training exercises, Grevich watched as machine gun crews struggled to keep pace with advancing rifle platoon. He watched suppressive fire arrive too late to save Marines caught in killing zones. He saw demolition teams pinned down because machine guns could not deliver sufficient fire to suppress mock defensive positions. He knew a better solution existed because he had helped build it a year earlier on Bougainville. The memory of that first Stinger cobbled together in the field and never tested in combat nared at him. He had seen what the weapon could do in test firing. He had watched Cole's crude modification devastate a Japanese attack. He knew that properly engineered versions of the Stinger could give Marine rifle companies the firepower advantage they desperately needed. Grevich approached his company commander with a proposal. He could build modified aircraft machine guns, weapons that would give each platoon unprecedented firepower. The company commander, intrigued but cautious, understood that unauthorized modification of government property could result in court-martial. But he also understood that his Marines were training for an assault that would require every possible advantage. The request was passed up the chain of command to the battalion commander. Remarkably, perhaps reflecting the paramarine culture that permeated the 28th Marines, the battalion commander approved. This approval came with an important caveat that would prove crucial for Grevich's protection. The modifications were not officially sanctioned by Marine Corps headquarters. They were not part of any approved weapons system, not listed in any table of organization and equipment. Festingers would not appear on any official property records, would not be subject to formal inspection, would exist in the gray area between field modification and unauthorized equipment, but they were authorized at the battalion level. A crucial distinction that would protect Grevich from charges of unauthorized modification of government property. The battalion commander put his approval in writing, creating a paper trail that legitimized the project within the battalion's sphere of authority, even if it lacked higher-level sanction. This distinction might seem like bureaucratic hair-splitting, but it reflected a sophisticated understanding of military authority and responsibility. The battalion commander was essentially accepting personal responsibility for the modification program, betting his career on Grevich's ability to deliver effective weapons. Grevich set to work in Hawaii with the assistance of Private First Class John Little, his partner from the Bougainville project. They scoured the island for crashed or damaged aircraft for spare parts, from aircraft being cannibalized for other purposes, for any source of AM-2 machine guns. Hawaii, as a major staging area for Pacific operations, hosted numerous air bases where damaged aircraft were evaluated for repair or salvage. The two Marines developed relationships with Navy and Marine Corps aviation personnel, explaining their project and requesting access to surplus weapons. Some aviation units were skeptical, questioning why ground troops wanted aircraft guns. Others were supportive, understanding that any innovation that might save Marine lives deserved support regardless of regulations. The construction process was meticulous despite the crude workshops available. Each Stinger required precise cutting of M1 Garand stocks, careful fabrication of trigger mechanisms, exact fitting of Barbie pods and sights. The work could not be rushed. A poorly fitted stock might crack under recoil. An improperly fabricated trigger might fail at a critical moment. Sights had to be precisely aligned to ensure accuracy. The trigger mechanism presented the greatest technical challenge. Aircraft machine guns used solenoid triggers activated by electrical switches, perfect for synchronized fire through propeller arcs, but useless for infantry work. The solenoid system required electrical power and offered no tactile feedback to the gunner. Gravich designed a simple mechanical trigger that could be fabricated from sheet metal and operated by finger pressure like a conventional rifle trigger. The mechanism needed to be strong enough to withstand repeated use and possible row handling in combat, but light enough that a gunner could maintain trigger control during sustained fire. The design went through several iterations before Gravich achieved the proper balance. Early versions were too stiff, requiring excessive finger pressure that made precise fire control difficult. Later versions were too light, creating the risk of accidental discharge. The final design used a carefully calculated spring tension that provided positive trigger feel without excessive pressure. The stock presented its own challenges. The M1 Garand stock was solid walnut, designed to withstand the considerable recoil of the .306 cartridge. The wood's density and grain structure provided excellent strength, but also made it difficult to work with hand tools. To fit the AM2 Sunique receiver and buffer tube configuration, Gravich had to carefully hollow out the stock, removing wood while maintaining structural integrity. Too much material removed would weaken the stock, potentially causing catastrophic failure during firing. Too little material removed would prevent proper fit of the receiver. Gravich worked slowly and carefully using chisels and files to remove wood incrementally, test-fitting the receiver repeatedly to ensure proper alignment and fit. The process for each stock took several days of patient work. The bipod and sight from the Browning automatic rifle required adapter fabrication. The mounting points on the bar components did not align with the AM2's configuration, necessitating custom-made brackets. These brackets had to be strong enough to maintain zero under the stress of firing, but light enough not to significantly increase the weapon's overall weight. Gravich fabricated the brackets from steel plate, drilling and tapping mounting holes, bending metal to achieve proper angles, welding reinforcement where stress analysis indicated potential failure points. Each bracket was test-fitted, adjusted, and refitted until the bipod and sight mounted solidly with no play or movement. The work was painstaking, each Stinger representing dozens of hours of skilled labor. But Gravich understood that lives would depend on these weapons. A malfunction in combat meant not just a failed weapon, but potentially dead Marines. Every weld had to be sound. Every fit had to be precise. Every component had to be tested and verified. By January 1945, as the 5th Marine Division prepared to board ships for the journey to Iwo Jima, Gravich had completed 6 Stingers. Each weapon had been test-fired extensively, adjusted and refined until it functioned reliably. The testing revealed the fundamental limitation that would constrain Stinger employment in combat. The overheating problem inherent in the thin aircraft barrel could not be eliminated. Without the cooling effect of aircraft slipstream, the barrel would grow dangerously hot after sustained fire. Extended firing could actually cause the barrel to warp or even melt, rendering the weapon useless. Gravich trained his gunners in strict fire discipline. Short bursts only, 3 to 5 seconds maximum, allowing the barrel to cool between engagements. This discipline was absolutely critical. An overheated stinger was worse than no stinger at all, as it represented wasted weight, and a gunner who could have been carrying a conventional weapon. The 6 guns represented countless hours of work, materials acquired through unofficial channels, modifications that existed in a gray area between innovation and regulation. But they were also exactly what the 28th Marines needed for Iwo Jima. The weapons offered firepower that no other rifle company in the division could match. The distribution of the 6 Stingers was carefully considered. 1 went to each of G Company's 3 rifle platoon, providing each with organic firepower that exceeded their authorized weapons. The platoon commanders received special briefings on employment tactics, learning how to maximize the Stinger's capabilities while managing its limitations. 1 gun went to the company's demolition section, where it would provide covering fire for engineers attacking fortified positions. The 5th gun kept for himself, taking personal responsibility for employing the weapon he had created. The 6th Stinger went to a Marine from a company, 28th Marines. His name was Tony Stein, and his actions with this weapon would help him earn the nation's highest decoration for valor. Tony Stein was born on September 30th, 1921, in Dayton, Ohio, to immigrant parents from Austria-Hungary. His parents had come to America seeking opportunity and freedom from the political instability of Central Europe. They settled in Dayton, part of the wave of Eastern European immigration that transformed American industrial cities in the early 20th century. The Stein family struggled financially, particularly during the Great Depression. When economic hardship forced difficult choices, Tony dropped out of high school during his freshman year. This was not uncommon during the Depression, when family survival often required every able-bodied person to work. Education was a luxury that many families simply could not afford. Tony found work where he could, eventually securing an apprenticeship as a toolmaker. This training proved far more valuable than any academic education he might have received. Tool making in the 1930s required understanding of precision measurement, material properties, machine operation, and manufacturing processes. A skilled toolmaker needed to read technical drawings, calculate tolerances, operate lathes and milling machines, and create precisely fabricated components. The work demanded patience, attention to detail, and problem-solving ability. Toolmakers created the specialized tools and dies used in mass production, meaning their work had to be absolutely precise. An error of a few thousandth of an inch could render an entire production run unusable. This training gave Stein hands-on experience with metal fabrication remarkably similar to what would be required to modify aircraft machine guns. He understood stress points and material tolerances. He knew how to fabricate custom components. He had the practical knowledge to look at a piece of equipment and understand how it could be modified or improved. When war came, Stein did not wait for the draft. On September 22, 1942, shortly before his 21st birthday, he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve. The timing was significant. By September 1942, America had been at war for nearly 10 months. The initial wave of patriotic volunteers had already enlisted. The reality of war's cost was becoming clear through casualty reports from Guadalcanal and other early Pacific battles. Stein knew what he was volunteering for. The Marines had a reputation for getting the hardest assignments, for going in first, for suffering the highest casualties. He wanted to defend his country, and he wanted to do it where the fighting was fiercest. This decision revealed key aspects of his character: a willingness to face danger, a sense of duty that transcended personal safety, a belief that his country's defense required his service regardless of risk. Stein's recruit training at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego marked him as exceptional. The training was deliberately brutal, designed to break down civilian habits and build Marine discipline. Physical conditioning pushed recruits to their limits. Marksmanship training demanded precision. Close order drill instilled instant obedience to commands. Some recruits barely survived this training. Others excelled, demonstrating the physical toughness, mental resilience, and leadership potential that marked them for elite assignments. Stein impressed his drill instructors sufficiently to be selected for Marine parachute training at Camp Gillespie. The Paramarine selection was an honor, but it also meant volunteering for even more demanding training. Parachute school had a high washout rate. The physical requirements were extreme, the training dangerous, the discipline stricter than conventional Marine units. Those who completed the course joined an elite brotherhood characterized by exceptional esprit. Though the Paramarines never jumped into combat, their training created Marines of unusual capability and initiative. The curriculum emphasized independent thinking, small unit tactics, and adaptability. Paramarines were expected to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support, which required soldiers who could think for themselves and solve problems without detailed orders. When the parachute battalions disbanded, Stein was promoted to corporal and assigned to the 5th Marine Division, serving as assistant squad leader of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines. His toolmaker skills made him invaluable for weapons maintenance and modification. In any infantry unit, there are always weapons that need adjustment, sights that need alignment, magazines that need tuning. When word spread through the 28th Marines about Gravich's Stinger project, Stein's skills and interest made him a natural collaborator. The exact nature of his involvement remains unclear in historical records. Some sources suggest he assisted with fabrication of multiple Stingers. Others indicate he primarily worked on modifying his own weapon. What is certain is that Stein ended up with the 6th Stinger, the weapon that would help him earn the Medal of Honor. The relationship between Stein and his Stinger represented more than simply a soldier being issued a weapon. Stein understood the weapon intimately because he had helped create it. He knew its capabilities and limitations, knew exactly how hard he could push it before overheating became critical, knew the precise sight picture required for accurate fire. This intimate knowledge would prove crucial during the desperate fighting on Iwo Jima, where Stein would employ the Stinger with a tactical sophistication that maximized its unique capabilities. The journey to Iwo Jima began in January 1945, as the 5th Marine Division, along with the 3rd and 4th Marine Divisions, boarded transport ships in Hawaii. Approximately 70,000 Marines and attached Navy personnel crowded onto transports that would carry them 2,000 miles west across the Pacific. The men knew their destination by now. Security restrictions had been relaxed enough to allow detailed briefings. Marines studied aerial photographs of Iwo Jima, a pork-chop-shaped island dominated by Mount Suribachi on its southern tip. The island measured roughly 5 meters long and 2 meters at its widest point, comprising approximately 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash. Intelligence officers explained the island's strategic importance using maps and charts. Iwo Jima sat roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo, positioned between the newly captured Marianas and the Japanese home islands. In American hands, the Highlands airfields could serve multiple critical functions. B-29 Super Fortress bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan operated at the extreme edge of their range. Any damages sustained over the target meant potentially ditching in the ocean during the long flight home. Iwo Jima would provide an emergency landing strip where damaged bombers could land for repairs rather than attempting the full return flight. The island could also base fighter escorts for the bombers. The P-51 Mustang had sufficient range to accompany B-29s to Japan and back if it could refuel at Iwo Jima. Fighter escort would dramatically improve bomber survival rates against Japanese air defenses. Finally, Iwo Jima would act as a springboard for the eventual invasion of Japan itself, providing forward bases for air support, logistics, and command centers. Yet intelligence officers could not fully communicate the sophistication of Japanese fortifications. Reconnaissance reports from aerial observation and submarine patrols greatly underestimated both the size of the garrison and the depth of the defensive works. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, assigned to hold Iwo Jima in June 1944, had 9 months to prepare. A seasoned officer with extensive combat experience in China and formal study at the Army War College, Kuribayashi understood both the tactical and strategic realities confronting Japan. He recognized that the nation had effectively lost the war. American industrial output, military capacity, and technological advantages made defeat inevitable. However, the timing and conditions of that defeat remained uncertain. If Japan could make the invasion extraordinarily costly, if American casualties mounted high enough, political pressure might force negotiations rather than unconditional surrender. Kuribayashi's goal was not outright victory, but delay. Not to hold Iwo Jima indefinitely, but to inflict such a terrible cost that the Americans might reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. He approached this task with meticulous calculation and innovative defensive planning. Traditional Japanese doctrine had called for resisting at the shoreline, meeting invaders on the beaches, and destroying them before they could gain a foothold. While successful in earlier conflicts, this method had become increasingly ineffective against American amphibious forces. Naval gunfire and air support could obliterate beach defenses, and American armor could punch through positions that halted infantry. Kuribayashi rejected this conventional approach. He directed his 21,000 troops to entrench deeply into Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain, constructing an underground fortress capable of withstanding even the heaviest bombardment. His men excavated 18 kilometers of tunnels, forming a connected network of fighting positions, supply caches, and command centers. Hundreds of concealed pillboxes were built from reinforced concrete and volcanic rock, camouflaged so skillfully they were nearly invisible from air or ground until attackers were almost on top of them. Each emplacement was positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that neutralizing one position immediately exposed attackers to another. Artillery and mortar emplacements were placed in caves and protected bunkers, allowing Japanese gunners to fire on pre-designated targets before retreating to safety. Pre-registered firing points covered every likely avenue of approach, every beach, and every terrain feature that the Americans might use for cover. Kuribayashi trained his men in a defensive doctrine that rejected the banzai, charges and suicidal assaults that had characterized earlier Japanese resistance. There would be no symbolic gestures of honor, no dramatic but tactically pointless attacks. Every soldier would fight from cover, fire only at viable targets, inflict maximum casualties while preserving his own life as long as possible. Each defender was ordered to kill 10 Americans before dying. Positions would be defended to the last man, but soldiers would not waste themselves in futile assaults. The Americans would have to extract defenders one position at a time, paying in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. The discipline required was extraordinary. Japanese military culture emphasized bold offensive action, glorious death, and honor through sacrifice. Kuribayashi demanded that his men abandon these values, accepting their eventual deaths, but ensuring they were as lethal to the enemy as possible. His success in instilling this discipline reflected both his leadership and the desperate situation Japan faced by early 1945. The defenders of Iwo Jima knew they were doomed, that no reinforcements would arrive, and that their only hope was to die in a manner that served Japan's final defense. Pre-invasion bombardment began on February 16, 1945. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the Marines, had requested 10 days of naval shelling based on intelligence estimates of Japanese strength, knowing from hard experience that neutralizing fortified positions required sustained fire. The Navy provided 3. This reflected both the broader strategic demands of the Pacific Campaign and a fundamental misreading of Iwo Jima's defenses. Planners believed 3 days of concentrated fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would suffice to silence the defenders. For 72 hours, the largest naval task force assembled in the Pacific hammered Iwo Jima. Battleships fired 16-inch guns, hurling shells exceeding a ton into volcanic rock. Cruisers added 8-inch bombardments. Destroyers engaged specific targets close inshore with 5-inch guns. Thousands of shells rained on the island every hour, blasting terrain away. From the transports, Marines saw the island seemingly disintegrating. B-29 bombers from the Marianas added heavy strikes to the naval fire, while carrier-based aircraft attacked visible targets systematically. The combined firepower was the most concentrated bombardment delivered against a Pacific island to date. Marines watched, confident that nothing could survive it. Intelligence estimated 1 week to secure the island. Some officers privately hoped for 3 or 4 days. They were catastrophically wrong. Despite the awe-inspiring display, the bombardment barely touched Kuribayashi's underground fortress. Shells designed for ship armor or surface structures could not penetrate deeply into the volcanic tunnels. Bombs left massive craters but failed to collapse the networks below. Following Kuribayashi's orders, defenders remained hidden, did not return fire, and did not reveal positions, leaving Americans to bombard empty terrain. When the bombardment ended on February 19th, the Japanese emerged largely intact, with functional weapons, unspent ammunition, and viable positions. The 3 days had done little beyond signaling the imminence of the invasion. February 19, 1945, dawned clear and cold. At 9 a.m., the first assault wave, the 5th Marine Division on the left, 4th on the right, would land across 700 yards of beach designated green, red, yellow, and blue from south to north. Amtraks churned toward shore. Men braced for Mount Suribachi, a 554-foot dormant volcano dominating the southern end of the island. Naval fire shifted inland as the first wave approached, and an eerie silence blanketed Iwima. Marines hit the beach precisely at 9 and immediately faced their first obstacle: volcanic ash, black and loose, rising in 15-foot terraces. Men sank ankle-deep, some to their knees. Vehicles bogged down. Tanks and Amtraks struggled futilely on the slopes. Equipment meant to support infantry stalled within yards of the waterline. Marines clawed forward, expecting enemy fire at any moment. The silence persisted, broken only by inland naval fire and the labored breathing of men struggling through the ash. Officers checked watches nervously. The lack of resistance felt wrong, ominous. For nearly an hour, Japanese troops held their fire, adhering strictly to Kuribayashi's orders. Let the Americans land, let them cluster on the beach, struggle forward, and accumulate men in the kill zone. Wait until a single command could unleash devastation. At approximately 10 hours, with the beach crowded with troops and vehicles, the island erupted. Artillery and mortar fire struck in deadly concentration from pre-registered positions, high explosive shells tearing through clustered Marines. Mortars dropped with dull thuds into volcanic ash before detonating. Machine guns fired from concealed pillboxes in terraces, camouflaged so well that Marines could not locate them. Interlocking fields of fire meant that seeking cover from one position exposed them to another. Marines died in black ash, cut down by unseen fire from invisible positions. Men tried to dig in, but loose volcanic ash collapsed faster than they could excavate. Wounded Marines sank into the ground. Corpsmen treating the injured became casualties themselves. Officers organizing advances were cut down. The 28th Marines, landing on the far left, aimed to isolate Mount Suribachi, moving directly into some of Kuribayashi's strongest defenses. Tony Stein was the first of his unit to advance after landing. While others sought cover or struggled with gear, Stein pressed forward carrying his Stinger. At only 25 pounds, light for a machine gun, it allowed him to move rapidly over the treacherous terrain. As his platoon tried to establish a foothold, Stein laid down covering fire. Its incredible rate of fire stunned both sides. Japanese defenders who had faced Browning machine guns were suddenly confronted with a continuous roar. a tearing sound like canvas ripped at high speed. The volume of fire created visible streaks toward targets, appearing almost as a solid line of fire. When Stein's comrades became pinned down by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire, he made a decision that defied every survival instinct. He stood upright, completely exposed, deliberately drawing Japanese fire to himself. This was not reckless bravado, but tactical calculation born from training and combat instinct. By exposing himself, Stein forced the Japanese to reveal their positions by firing at him. The muzzle flashes, the puffs of dust kicked up by firing, the slight movement of camouflage being disturbed. All these things became visible when the Japanese engaged such a prominent target. Once he located hostile guns, Stein could engage them with the Stinger. The weapon proved devastatingly effective against pillboxes. Its high rate of fire allowed Stein to pour enough rounds into firing ports to suppress or eliminate the defenders inside. A 3-second burst sent 75 rounds into a space, perhaps 18 in square. A concentration of fire that gave defenders no opportunity to return fire effectively. Stein charged Japanese pillboxes one by one, firing the Stinger from the hip in short, controlled bursts. The technique required tremendous upper body strength and weapon control. The Stinger, despite its relatively light weight, generated significant recoil when firing at 200 rounds per minute. Maintaining aim while advancing required strength, skill, and absolute focus. The Stinger consumed ammunition at an alarming rate. Despite Stein's discipline in using short bursts rather than sustained fire, he rapidly exhausted his supply. The weapon's primary limitation, its prodigious appetite for ammunition, became critical in sustained combat. When the Stinger ran dry, Stein made a decision that combined courage with practical necessity. He kicked off his shoes and threw down his helmet, items that would slow him down, and ran back to the beach to retrieve ammunition. The decision to remove shoes and helmet seems almost incomprehensible to modern readers. These items provided protection and support, but Stein understood that speed mattered more than protection during the 400-yard dash back to the beach. The volcanic ash was treacherous for running, even in bare feet, nearly impossible in boots that would sink and catch with every step. The 400 WWII's back to the beach took him across open ground, swept by Japanese fire. Artillery and mortar rounds were still falling on the beach. Machine guns covered the approaches. Snipers looked for targets of opportunity. But Stein ran the gauntlet, reached the beach, grabbed ammunition, and ran back to his position. He made this run 8 times during that first day. 8 times he sprinted through hell. 8 times he returned carrying the 100-round ammunition boxes that kept the Stinger firing. And every single time he made the return trip, he carried or assisted a wounded Marine back with him. This detail, specifically mentioned in his Medal of Honor citation, reveals Stein's character as clearly as any combat action. He could have made the ammunition runs faster if he ran alone. He could have maximized his own survival chances by minimizing time spent exposed. But on every return trip, he looked for wounded Marines who needed evacuation, and he helped get them to the beach where corpsmen could treat them. During these frantic hours of combat, Stein personally killed at least 20 Japanese defenders. This number, documented in his Medal of Honor citation, represents confirmed kills observed by other Marines. The actual number was likely higher as many. Enemy casualties occurred inside pillboxes where observers could not verify results. He destroyed multiple pillboxes that had pinned down his platoon, allowing other Marines to advance. Each pillbox neutralized represented lives saved, wounded prevented, tactical objectives achieved. The Stinger was shot out of Stein's hands twice by Japanese fire. The weapon was struck by bullets that should have killed Stein, but instead damaged only the gun. Both times he retrieved ammunition, performed field repairs if possible, or grabbed another weapon and continued fighting. By nightfall on February 19th, the Marines had established a precarious toehold on Iwo Jima. They had advanced perhaps 100 to 500 WWII inland across a front several thousand yards wide. The 28th Marines had reached the base of Mount Suribachi, but had not yet begun the climb. The cost had been horrific. More than 2,400 Marines were killed or wounded on D-Day alone, the highest single-day casualty rate of any amphibious assault in the Pacific War. The optimistic predictions of a one-week campaign were already revealed as fantasy. That night, Marines dug in as best they could in the volcanic ash, knowing that Japanese infiltrators and counterattacks would probe their lines throughout the hours of darkness. The wounded were evacuated to ships offshore when possible, though many remained on the beach throughout the night, waiting for transport. Tony Stein cleaned the Stinger, checked its function, and prepared for the next day's fighting. The weapon had performed magnificently beyond even the optimistic expectations of its creators. But the battle had barely begun. The battle for Iwo Jima would continue for 36 more days, each bringing fresh horrors as Marines fought to clear the island foot by bloody foot. The fighting evolved into a brutal contest of attrition with Marines, attacking fortified positions that had to be destroyed one at a time. The 28th Marines drove south toward Mount Suribachi, while other regiments pushed north and east across the island. The volcano's lower slopes were honeycombed with defensive positions, each one covering the approaches to others, creating a defensive network that defied simple tactics. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads worked in coordination with machine guns and rifles. The standard technique involved suppressing a position with rifle and machine gun fire, while demolition teams maneuvered close enough to destroy it with satchel charges or flamethrowers. But even destroyed positions might be reoccupied overnight as Japanese troops moved through tunnel networks. The Stingers proved invaluable in this fighting. Their concentrated firepower allowed Marines to suppress pillboxes long enough for demolition teams to approach and destroy them. The weapon's high rate of fire created the kind of overwhelming suppression that gave attackers those crucial seconds needed to close with enemy positions. On February 23rd, just 4 days into the fighting, a patrol from the 28th Marines climbed Mount Suribachi and raised a small American flag on the summit. The flag raising, visible from across the island and from the ships offshore, provided a tremendous morale boost to Marines still fighting in the volcanic wasteland below. Hours later, a larger flag was raised by a different group of Marines. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, positioned to photograph what he thought would be a routine flag replacement, captured that second raising in what would become the most famous photograph of World War II. The iconic image showed 6 Marines struggling to raise the flagpole against wind on Suribachi's summit, a moment of triumph and determination that came to symbolize American resolve and sacrifice. But the photograph also created a misleading impression that the battle was nearly over. In reality, the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Tony Stein witnessed the flag raising from below. Mount Suribachi's capture represented a significant tactical victory, securing the southern portion of the island and eliminating the defensive positions that had poured fire onto the beaches since D-Day. But the victory had come at terrible cost. Stein himself had been wounded during the fighting on Suribachi's slopes, injuries serious enough that he was evacuated to a hospital ship for treatment. The exact nature of his wounds is not detailed in historical records, but they were sufficient to warrant evacuation from the front lines. Aboard ship recovering from his wounds, Stein learned that his company was heavily engaged in vicious fighting for a position designated Hill 362A on the northern part of the island. Company A had suffered heavy casualties. The fighting was desperate and every Marine was needed. Despite his injuries, despite being legitimately evacuated and under medical care, Stein left the hospital ship and returned to his unit. He could not remain safe while his Marines fought and died on Hill 362A. This decision was characteristic of the bond between Marines, the sense of brotherhood that transcended personal safety. Stein's squad was fighting without him. His absence meant someone else had to carry the stinger. Someone else had to provide that crucial suppressive fire. Someone else was exposed to the dangers he could face in their place. On March 1, 1945, 10 days after his Medal of Honor actions, Tony Stein volunteered to lead a 19-man patrol to reconnoiter Japanese positions that had Company A pinned down. The patrol's mission was to identify enemy machine gun emplacements so that the company could coordinate attacks to neutralize them. Stein carried his stinger, the weapon that had become his signature, the tool he understood better than anyone. The patrol moved forward carefully, using what cover the volcanic terrain provided, watching for the nearly invisible firing ports that marked Japanese defensive positions. Stein located one pillbox and engaged it with the stinger, pouring suppressive fire into the position. The familiar tearing roar of the weapon echoed across the volcanic rock, the sound that had become a symbol of hope to Marines and terror to Japanese defenders. But as Stein concentrated on that target, fire from another concealed position found him. The Japanese defensive network was designed specifically to create these situations where attacking one position exposed the attacker to fire from another. A Japanese sniper positioned in a carefully camouflaged hide acquired Stein in his sights and fired a single shot. The round struck true, and Tony Stein, 24 years old, fell dead in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. His body was initially buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on the island, grave number 1107, plot 5, row 6. He joined thousands of other Marines who would be temporarily interred on Iwo Jima before being returned home after the war. The patrol recovered his body and his stinger. The weapon, marked by the combat it had seen, the modifications that made it unique, was eventually lost to history. Like the other 5 stingers, the Marine Corps, institutionally averse to non-standard equipment, likely destroyed them after the battle. Gravich and the other Stinger gunners continued fighting throughout the remaining weeks of the battle. The 28th Marines participated in some of the war's most vicious combat, attacking fortified positions across terrain that offered minimal cover and against defenders who fought with suicidal determination. The battle officially ended on March 26, 1945, though isolated pockets of resistance continued for days afterward. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their tunnels and pillboxes, fighting to the last, as Kuribayashi had ordered. The general himself was never found, his body lost among the thousands of Japanese dead. His fate remains unknown, though most historians believe he died in the final days of fighting, probably leading a small counterattack or defending one of the last command posts. American casualties were staggering and shocking. The 3 Marine divisions suffered 6,821 killed in action or missing and presumed dead. Another 19th WWII were wounded. Navy corpsmen and surgeons assigned to the Marines added 209 more killed. More than 800 Americans died for every square mile of Iwo Jima's volcanic sand. The casualty rate approached 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima became a casualty. Some units suffered much higher rates. The 28th Marines, which bore the brunt of fighting for Mount Suribachi and subsequent northern operations, was decimated. The strategic value of Iwo Jima would be debated for decades. The island did serve as an emergency landing field for B-29 bombers, with more than 2,000 emergency landings recorded before the end of the war. Fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima did accompany bombers to Japan, improving survival rates and bombing effectiveness. But whether these benefits justified the terrible cost remained controversial. Some historians argue that Iwo Jima was strategically necessary, that the lives saved by emergency landings and fighter escort exceeded the lives lost taking the island. Others contend that the island could have been bypassed, that its strategic value did not warrant the casualties suffered. What cannot be debated is the courage and sacrifice of the Marines who fought there, who advanced across volcanic ash under withering fire, who attacked fortified positions knowing the odds of survival were low, who continued fighting despite casualties that would have broken lesser units. The recommendation for Tony Stein's Medal of Honor began with his company commander's initial report of his actions on February 19th. The company commander had witnessed Stein's extraordinary courage firsthand, had seen him standing upright under fire, charging pillboxes, making those 8 trips back to the beach. Their commendation moved up through channels, gathering endorsements at each level. Battalion commander, regimental commander, division commander each reviewed the recommendation and added their endorsement. The detailed narrative of Stein's actions grew with each level of review, as additional witnesses contributed their observations. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander and Chief Pacific Fleet, reviewed their commendation and approved it. Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift, himself a Medal of Honor recipient for actions on Guadalcanal, reviewed and approved. Chief of Naval Operations Fleet Admiral Ernest King, the senior naval officer in the entire U.S. military, reviewed and approved. Stein's Medal of Honor received 15 endorsements, the most of any award in the Iwo Jima campaign. This number reflected both the extraordinary nature of his actions and the number of witnesses who could testify to what they'd seen. The final citation approved by President Harry Truman praised Stein's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It described his personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, making it perhaps the only Medal of Honor citation that explicitly references an unauthorized weapon modification. The citation detailed his rapid covering fire for advancing units, his willingness to expose himself to draw Japanese fire and locate enemy positions, his charges against pillboxes, his 8 trips back to the beach for ammunition, while carrying or assisting wounded Marines. Each element was documented and verified by multiple witnesses. Exactly 1 year after his heroic actions on February 19, 1946, Tony Stein's widow, Joan, received his Medal of Honor at the Ohio State House in Columbus. Vice Admiral Frederick William Penoya, Jr., commander of the 9th Naval District, tied the medal around her neck in a ceremony attended by Ohio Governor Frank Luash and Stein's mother, Rose. The 3 of them stood together, united in grief and pride, tears streaming down their faces as they listened to the citation being read. Joan was 24 years old, the same age Tony had been when he died. She wore black, holding the medal that represented her husband's sacrifice, the physical embodiment of courage that had cost her everything. Rosa Stein, who had immigrated from Austria-Hungary, seeking a better life for her children, who had worked and sacrificed to give her son opportunities, stood beside her daughter-in-law, mourning the price of those opportunities. Her son had died defending the country that had given his family refuge, had sacrificed himself for American ideals and American lives. The ceremony was dignified and solemn, befitting the sacrifice it honored, but it could not fill the void left by Tony's death, could not restore what had been lost on that volcanic island 7,000 miles away. Later, a dispute arose between Stein's mother and his widow regarding burial arrangements. Rose wanted her son buried in a Jewish cemetery, respecting the religious traditions of their family. Joan wanted him buried following funeral services at her church, honoring the Catholic faith they had shared as a married couple. The dispute became contentious, complicated by Joan's remarriage after Tony's death. Ultimately, military authorities sided with Joan as the legal next of kin. When Stein's remains were returned from Iwo Jima in December 1948, they were buried at Calvary Cemetery in Dayton, following funeral services at Our Lady of the Rosary Church. The burial provided some measure of closure, bringing Tony home to rest in the city where he had grown up, learned his trade, met his wife, and decided to become a Marine. But closure could not erase the loss, could not restore the life that ended too soon on volcanic sand. After the battle, the 6 Stingers disappeared from historical record. The Marine Corps, institutionally conservative and averse to non-standard equipment, almost certainly destroyed them. Official property records would have no category for unauthorized weapon modifications. Tables of organization and equipment did not list Stingers. No procurement codes existed for their components. From a bureaucratic perspective, the Stingers were problems. They represented unauthorized modifications of government property. They consumed ammunition at rates that complicated supply planning. They required specialized training that wasn't part of standard curricula. They existed outside the formal structure of military organization. No official documentation exists for the Stinger program because it was never official. The weapons existed in a gray area, approved at battalion level, but never sanctioned by higher headquarters. Milan Grevich had authorization from his battalion commander, written approval that protected him from charges of unauthorized modification, but that authorization extended only to building the weapons, not to preserving them after the battle. In the immediate aftermath of Iwo Jima, there was brief discussion about mass-reducing Stingers for issue to Marine rifle companies. The weapons had proven themselves. In combat had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded any standard light machine gun. Officers who had witnessed Stinger performance wrote enthusiastic reports recommending wider adoption. But the war ended 6 months after Iwo Jima, and the urgent need disappeared with Japan's surrender. The massive military establishment that had prosecuted the war began rapid demobilization. Weapons development programs were canceled. Procurement budgets were slashed. The focus shifted from wartime innovation to peacetime standardization. In this environment, the Stinger had no future. It was a weapon born of wartime necessity created by individual initiative to solve specific tactical problems. When those problems disappeared with Japan's surrender, so did institutional interest in the solution. The weapons themselves were probably destroyed during the general cleanup that followed combat operations. Damaged equipment was collected and disposed of. Non-standard weapons were destroyed to prevent unauthorized distribution. The Stingers, marked by combat use and extensive modification, would have been obvious candidates for destruction. Thus ended the combat career of one of the most innovative infantry weapons of World War II. 6 weapons built in workshops with hand tools, employed in combat for 6 weeks, then destroyed and forgotten by the institution they had served. Milan Grevich survived and the war. He returned to Minnesota, carrying with him the knowledge that his innovation had saved Marine lives, had helped achieve victory in one of history's bloodiest battles. The Stinger's contribution could not be quantified precisely. There was no way to know exactly how many Marines survived because Stinger fire suppressed the pillbox that would have killed them. But Grevich knew, as did the Marines who had fought alongside Stinger gunners, that the weapons made a difference. The concentrated firepower they provided created tactical opportunities that conventional weapons could not. The suppressive capability they offered gave demolition teams the seconds they needed to close with enemy positions. Grevich never sought recognition for the Stinger, never pushed for official acknowledgement of his role in developing it. He understood that the weapon was just one small piece of a much larger story, one innovation among countless others made by Marines who saw problems and fixed them. This humility was characteristic of his generation of combat veterans. They had done what needed to be done, had served when called, had survived when others had not. They came home and rebuilt their lives, carrying memories they rarely discussed, knowledge of horrors they could not explain to those who had not been there. Grevich returned to the trades, using the mechanical skills that had served him so well during the war. He married, raised a family, lived a quiet life far from the volcanic beaches, where he had helped create a weapon that changed the course of battle. In later years, as historians began documenting the Stinger story, Grevich would occasionally share his recollections. He spoke matter-of-factly about the weapon's development, describing technical details and tactical employment without drama or embellishment. To him, the Stinger was a practical solution to a tactical problem, not a historic innovation worthy of special recognition. This perspective, while admirable in its modesty, somewhat obscures the significance of what Grevich achieved. Working with hand tools in improvised workshops without engineering support or official sanction, he and John Little created a weapon that dramatically outperformed the standard equipment issued by the world's most powerful military. They identified a capability gap, recognized that existing equipment could fill that gap if properly modified, acquired necessary components through unofficial channels, fabricated custom parts, tested and refined their design, trained gunners in proper employment, and deployed the weapons into combat. This entire process, from conception to combat use, took approximately 3 months. Modern weapons acquisition programs require years or decades to accomplish similar developments. The bureaucratic process alone, from identifying the requirement to fielding the solution, typically exceeds the time Grevich spent building 6 functional Stingers. The lessons of the Stinger were both learned and forgotten. Learned in the sense that Marines continued to value innovation, continued to encourage the kind of initiative that Grevich displayed. The Corps maintained its culture of expecting junior leaders to solve problems, to adapt to circumstances, to do whatever was necessary to accomplish the mission. This culture manifested in countless ways throughout subsequent conflicts. In Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Marines improvised solutions to problems that official channels could not address quickly enough. They modified equipment, developed new tactics, created local solutions to local problems. But the lessons were also forgotten in important ways. The institutional military remained uncomfortable with unauthorized modifications, with weapons that existed outside official channels. The bureaucratic imperative toward standardization, while necessary for large-scale logistics, often stifled the kind of innovation that Grevich represented. Modern military regulations governing weapons modifications are strict and comprehensive. Unauthorized modifications are prohibited and punishable. Every weapon must conform to official specifications. This standardization serves important purposes, ensuring reliability, safety, and logistics compatibility across large organizations. But it also prevents the kind of rapid innovation that the Stinger represented. A modern sergeant who attempted what Grevich did, modifying aircraft weapons for infantry use without formal authorization, would face court-martial regardless of how effective the modifications proved in combat. The tension between standardization and innovation remains unresolved. Large military organizations require standardization for logistics, training, and maintenance. But combat effectiveness sometimes demands innovation that official channels cannot provide quickly enough. Finding the balance between these competing demands continues to challenge military leadership. The Stinger's role in Tony Stein's Medal of Honor actions demonstrates the symbiotic relationship between warrior and weapon, between tactical skill and technical advantage. The Stinger made Stein more effective, providing firepower that conventional weapons could not match, but only because Stein possessed the courage to wield it as it needed to be wielded. The weapon's capabilities were meaningless without a warrior willing to stand upright under fire, to charge pillboxes, to run through hell 8 times to keep it fed. Another Marine, given the same weapon, might have used it more cautiously, might have achieved less spectacular results, might have survived February 19th to fight another day. Stein's tactical judgment, honed by para-marine training and sharpened by combat experience, told him how to maximize the Stinger's unique capabilities. He understood that the weapon's high rate of fire could suppress pillboxes in ways conventional machine guns could not. He recognized that concentrated bursts into firing ports would force defenders to take cover, creating opportunities for advance. He also understood the weapon's limitations, the need for fire discipline to prevent overheating, the rapid ammunition consumption that required frequent resupply, the trade-off between mobility and sustained fire. These limitations shaped his tactics, driving the decision to make those 8 ammunition runs rather than trying to conserve rounds. If we could somehow interview the Japanese defenders who faced Stein and his Stinger on February 19th, we would likely hear a consistent story. The sound was wrong, impossibly fast, suggesting multiple machine guns when it was actually just one. The volume of fire was overwhelming, suppressing defensive positions that should have been able to hold. The psychological dimension of weapons effectiveness often gets overlooked in technical analyses. A weapon that demoralizes the enemy, that creates hesitation and fear, can be as effective as one that simply kills more efficiently. The Stinger achieved both, combining exceptional lethality with psychological impact that multiplied its tactical value. Japanese defenders who had successfully resisted conventional machine gun fire found themselves unable to maintain defensive fire when engaged by the Stinger. The weapon created a terror effect, a sense that resistance was futile against such overwhelming firepower. This psychological impact contributed to Stein's ability to suppress and destroy pillboxes that should have been nearly impregnable. The Battle of Iwo Jima produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other battle in American history. This extraordinary number reflected both the severity of the fighting and the exceptional courage displayed by Marines at all levels. The recipients came from all ranks and backgrounds. There were privates and privates first class, corporals and sergeants, lieutenants and captains. Some received the medal for single extraordinary actions like Stein. Others received it for sustained heroism over days of combat. What united all 27 was willingness to accept risk to themselves to save others or accomplish the mission. They exposed themselves to enemy fire when survival instincts screamed to take cover. They charged enemy positions when reason suggested retreat. They continued fighting when wounded, returned to combat when evacuated, volunteered for missions they knew might be fatal. Tony Stein was one of these 27, but his award has unique character because of the Stinger's role in his actions. His citation specifically mentions the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, making it perhaps the only Medal of Honor that explicitly references an unauthorized weapon modification. This detail was important to the Marines who witnessed Stein's actions and wrote the recommendations that led to his medal. They knew the Stinger made a difference, that it enabled Stein to accomplish what would have been impossible with standard weapons. The weapon was inseparable from the heroism it enabled. The 15 endorsements Stein's award received, the most of any Medal of Honor from Iwo Jima, reflected the number of witnesses who could testify to his actions. But they also reflected the impression his courage made on everyone who witnessed it. Senior officers who reviewed the recommendation recognized that Stein's actions represented something extraordinary, even in a battle defined by extraordinary courage. In recent years, interest in the Stinger has grown among firearms historians and World War II researchers. The weapon represents a fascinating intersection of innovation, necessity, and combat effectiveness that makes it worthy of study beyond its limited combat use. The Canadian Historical Arms Museum commissioned a fully functional replica, working with firearms expert Paul Schull for the television show The Weapon Hunter. Building this replica took 3 months and required extensive research to recreate components that Gravich fabricated without any blueprints or documentation. Schull had to reverse engineer the modifications based on photographs, written descriptions, and understanding of the original components. The trigger mechanism was particularly challenging as no detailed documentation existed of Gravich's design. Schull created a mechanism that matched the general description and achieved similar functionality. But whether it precisely replicated Gravich's original design remains unknown. Another replica was built for the Clint Eastwood film Flags of Our Fathers, which depicted the Iwo Jima campaign and the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The scene featuring the Stinger was ultimately cut from the final version of the film, though the replica exists in the film's prop collection. Firearms expert Ian McCollum examined one of these replicas for his Forgotten Weapons series, a YouTube channel dedicated to documenting unusual and historically significant firearms. McCollum's detailed examination, watched by millions of viewers, introduced the Stinger to modern audiences who would otherwise never know such a weapon existed. These replicas and examinations serve important historical purposes. They preserve knowledge of the weapon's design and function. They demonstrate the practical challenges Grevich faced in creating the modifications. They allow modern researchers to understand the weapon's capabilities and limitations in ways that written descriptions alone cannot convey. But replicas, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot capture everything about the original Stingers. They lack the combat wear, the field repairs, the individual quirks that developed in weapons used under extreme conditions. They cannot convey what it felt like to carry that weapon across volcanic ash under fire, to feel it heating in your hands as you poured suppressive fire into enemy positions, to make those desperate runs for ammunition, knowing your Marines depended on you. The technical specifications of the Stinger tell only part of the story. 40 in long, 25 loaded, belt-fed with 100-round capacity, firing rate of 1/200 to 500 rounds per minute. These numbers describe capability, but cannot capture significance. What mattered was what those specifications meant in combat. The 40 in length made the weapon maneuverable in confined spaces, easier to carry through volcanic ash and across difficult terrain than the longer and heavier M191916. The 25 lb weight, while heavy for an individual weapon, was light enough for one Marine to carry and employ effectively. The belt-fed design meant rapid reloading compared to magazine-fed weapons. A gunner could swap 100-round boxes in seconds, maintaining sustained fire as long as ammunition lasted. The firing rate of 1/200 to 500 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than conventional machine guns, created the overwhelming suppressive effect that made the weapon so tactically valuable. The post-war period saw dramatic changes in infantry weapons that reflected some of the lessons learned from weapons like the Stinger. The M1919S6 was finally replaced by the M60 machine gun in the late 1950s. The M60 weighed 23 kg, comparable to the Stinger, and could be effectively employed by a single soldier. The M60's design incorporated lessons from both American and German weapons development during World War II. It used a quick-change barrel system that allowed gunners to replace overheated barrels in seconds, addressing one of the Stinger's fundamental limitations. It achieved cyclic rates of around 500 to 650 rounds per minute, faster than the M1919A6, but slower than the Stinger. Modern machine guns continue this evolution, providing incredible firepower in increasingly portable packages. The M249 squad automatic weapon weighs just 17 kg and fires 700 to 1,000 rounds per minute. The M240 machine gun, though heavier at 27 lb, offers exceptional reliability and sustained fire capability. Yet, none of these modern weapons fire as fast as the Stinger did. Modern military doctrine recognizes that extremely high rates of fire create more problems than they solve. They burn through ammunition too quickly, creating logistics challenges. They accelerate barrel wear, reducing weapon life. They reduce accuracy as recoil and barrel movement accumulate. The Stinger's 1,200 to 500 rounds per minute was only sustainable because of specific tactical circumstances. The 6-week duration of the Iwo Jima campaign meant barrel life was less critical than immediate firepower. The established logistics system meant ammunition could be delivered to the island by ship. The desperate nature of the fighting meant maximizing suppressive effect mattered more than conserving ammunition. In modern sustained operations, these trade-offs would be unacceptable. Modern machine guns balance rate of fire against sustained fire capability, ammunition economy, and barrel life. The result is weapons that fire slower than the Stinger, but can maintain that fire for extended periods without overheating or requiring excessive ammunition resupply. The Stinger represented a remarkable achievement in field engineering. Grevich and Little, working with hand tools in improvised workshops, created a weapon system that would have cost millions to develop through formal acquisition channels. As detailed earlier, this entire process, from identifying the capability gap to deploying combat-ready weapons, took approximately 3 months. By comparison, modern weapons acquisition programs require years or decades to field new equipment. The bureaucratic process alone typically exceeds the time Grevich spent building 6 functional Stingers. The M16 rifle, developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, took approximately 5 years from initial prototype to limited deployment and another 5 years to widespread issue. The M1 Abrams tank required more than a decade from initial design to deployment. Modern infantry weapons like the M4 carbine evolved over decades from previous designs. This comparison is not entirely fair. Modern weapons must meet stringent safety requirements, reliability standards, and performance specifications that Grevich's field modifications did not address. They must be manufacturable in quantity, maintainable in the field by soldiers with limited training, compatible with existing logistics systems. But the comparison does highlight the trade-off between institutional thoroughness and individual initiative. Official acquisition programs produce weapons that are safe, reliable, and standardized, but they move slowly, often too slowly to address immediate tactical needs. Field modifications like the Stinger can address tactical needs quickly, but lack the testing, documentation, and support that official programs provide. The ideal system would combine both approaches, maintaining the safety and reliability of formal acquisition while preserving space for rapid innovation when circumstances demand it. But achieving this balance remains challenging for large military organizations. Looking back across 80 years, the Stinger emerges as a symbol of Marine Corps culture at its finest. Initiative, aggression, innovation, mission focus, willingness to work outside normal channels when necessary. These values defined the Marines who built and wielded the Stinger. Tony Stein embodied these values in his Medal of Honor actions, standing upright in enemy fire because the mission required it, running across open ground 8 times because his weapon needed feeding, carrying wounded Marines to safety because they were his brothers, returning from the hospital ship to rejoin his unit because he could not abandon them. These were not the actions of a man following orders or adhering to regulations. These were the actions of a man who understood what needed to be done and did it regardless of personal risk. The Stinger enabled his effectiveness, but his courage created the opportunity for the weapon to prove its worth. Milan Grevich embodied these same values in creating the weapon. Seeing a problem that cost Marine lives, identifying a solution that regulations did not authorize, building it anyway because saving lives mattered more than following procedures, training others in its use because shared knowledge multiplied impact. Grevich never sought recognition for the Stinger. He never pushed for official acknowledgement of his role in developing it. To him, the weapon was simply what needed to be done, one Marine's contribution to helping other Marines survive and accomplish their mission. This humility, characteristic of his generation, perhaps obscures the significance of his achievement. But it also reflects values that made the achievement possible. Grevich did not build the Stinger for recognition or reward. He built it because Marines were dying for lack of adequate fire support, and he could do something about it. The Stinger never became official. It never appeared in weapons manuals or equipment tables. It never received a formal designation or procurement budget. No modern military uses weapons based on the Stinger design. No institutional memory preserves detailed knowledge of how they were built or employed. But for 6 brief weeks on the bloodiest beach in Marine Corps history, the Stinger gave Marines fighting and dying on volcanic rock, a weapon that helped them survive, helped them win, helped them accomplish a mission that cost more American lives than any other battle in the Pacific War. That contribution cannot be measured in official documentation or procurement records. It can only be measured in the Marines who came home because Tony Stein's Stinger suppressed the pillbox that would have killed them, because Milan Gravich built a weapon when the official weapons were inadequate, because initiative and innovation mattered more than regulations and procedures. 6 improvised weapons, 6 weeks of combat, 1 Medal of Honor, and countless Marines who lived because someone dared to build something better. The story of the Stinger reminds us that conflicts are often decided by those who devise solutions rather than those who rigidly follow orders, by those who experiment rather than those who wait for approval, by those who embrace risk rather than those who cling to safety. These lessons remain pertinent today as modern armed forces wrestle with balancing uniformity against ingenuity, formal procedure against personal initiative, institutional caution against operational necessity. The friction between these competing pressures will never be completely settled, but the Stinger narrative suggests that success demands making room for both approaches. The most effective military organizations are those that can uphold strict standards while still empowering individuals to address challenges creatively. They are institutions that recognize and reward initiative even when it questions established norms. They trust their people to act decisively, even when regulations might advise restraint. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, who wielded improvised weapons against an enemy intent on annihilation, who pressed forward when instinct urged retreat, embodied these principles. They exemplify the best of American military tradition. The belief that personal initiative and collective purpose can surmount any obstacle. Tony Stein fell on March 1, 1945. Yet his legacy persists in every Marine who refuses to accept that the standard solution is the only option, in every combatant who understands that missions sometimes require tools that do not yet exist, in every leader who empowers their people to innovate when circumstances demand it. Milan Gravich lived into old age, carrying vivid recollections of volcanic beaches and improvised weapons, of comrades lost and objectives achieved, of a time when necessity compelled ingenuity and valor enabled extraordinary outcomes. His efforts, though never formally acknowledged by the institution he served, saved lives and shaped the course of battles. The Stinger itself no longer exists, destroyed decades ago by an organization uneasy with tools that fell outside official channels. Yet its significance endures in military culture. The understanding that the most effective solution is often the one you create yourself, that regulations are meant to serve the mission rather than constrain it, that preserving life and achieving objectives outweigh bureaucratic comfort. This is the Stinger's enduring legacy. Not the machine, but the principles it embodied. Not the mechanical details, but the mindset that produced it. Not the unapproved modification, but the sanctioned courage to do what was necessary regardless of the rules. Ultimately, perhaps this is the most fitting tribute to both the weapon and the warriors who carried it into hell.